first, let's talk about the global south and Corona. I mentioned earlier the appalling stories of the United States using its naval vessels and ships to divert vital resources headed to the Caribbean, including ventilators to Barbados and Jamaica, even as the Venezuelan government, under siege from the United States, provides testing kits to several of its Caribbean neighbors. Let's go across some of the wider world and how this is playing out. In Mexico, border factories have continued to stay open despite the crisis. In Juarez, U.S.-owned factories that make car seat textiles and had workers report to the infirmary with coughs and fevers. They were given pain relief and told to get painkillers and told to go back to work. Mexico, who was not properly prepared after decades of austerity and significant cuts to the hospital system. Now, there's conflicting reports on how AMLO is responding. No question that AMLO is attempting to restore and build an actual safety net in Mexico, and that the same U.S. and reactionary forces are circling. AMLO, however, has refused, of course, to shut down the country, and we will see how those consequences play out. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, Donald Trump really should thank him, because there's always the one person in the world doing a worse, more buffoonish, ridiculous, grotesque job than Trump. He's been fighting with governors. He fired his own health minister. And just yesterday, he appeared hacking and extremely unhealthy looking at a protest against the quarantine. I'm sure all of us will swear to give our lives for our country one day, and we will do everything possible to change Brazil's destiny, he said. Meanwhile, President Lula on quarantine, who of course led by double digits in 2018, would be the president today without the US-backed Lava Jato operation in the continent of Africa. We've seen a variety of responses. And Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, said it could take a decade to recover if there's not an international response to COVID-19. The World Bank predicts a continent-wide depression in Africa. In South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa has won international credit and plaudits for international praise, for shutting down the country and enforcing a strict quarantine. However, police brutality reports have been rampant. And just like in the United States and elsewhere, there has not been a serious plan to protect workers and the poor during the shutdown. In India, the state of Kerala has won international praise. We've talked about it on this show. The communist-run state of Kerala has, along with South Korea, Taiwan, and others, actually been credited with incredible responses to the pandemic. They've instituted social distancing. They've mobilized community networks to help with monitoring the virus, but also delivering food and other vital necessities to people in vulnerable communities and throughout. Kerala stands out. Modi, like Orban and other authoritarians, is using this crisis to try to consolidate his power after inciting pogroms against the Muslim population and stripping the Indian constitution to occupy Kashmir. The government has, of course, targeted Muslims. The health minister has regularly blamed the Islamic seminaries for spreading the virus, and the BJP officials, the party of Prime Minister Modi, have used phrases like Corona jihad. Coronavirus is adding to an already deeply divided, deeply unequal world. It's wrecking health systems. It's adding to debt burdens and further jeopardizing economies dependent on the Western system. Remittance, which are a major factor in poorer countries, are down as the economy went into lockdown in the global north. International organizations are going to need to step up and provide enormous debt relief, global bailouts, and this also must be another opportunity for a serious rethink about how the global economy works, and can we at last have a world that centers workers and not predatory transnational capital. The consequences will live with us for decades if we don't act now and demand international debt jubilees and support the extraordinary bravery of governments and activists in the global South, whether they be at a regional or national levels, that are resisting and providing dynamic alternatives and paths forward. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
Just briefly, I just wanted to highlight that example about Juarez. That's one of the things that's so frightening about the coronavirus is it really is laying bare the inequities, obviously in the United States, but across the whole entire global supply chain. Those are workers working in an American-owned corporation, a corporation that basically is profiting off of the hyper-exploitation of those people. And they kept that factory open and allowed people to work even though they clearly had symptoms for a very long time. And now the COVID has actually spread from that factory across the entire city of Juarez. That was where it began in the area. And that's not an isolated story. We're seeing across the globe this kind of like squeeze for profit is putting people who are very marginalized in the first place in the way of this barreling train of coronavirus. So when we're talking about relief, we desperately need to be focusing on those stories as well and recognizing that all of these struggles are very much connected to this fundamental political and economic inequity of global capitalism.
Totally.
Yeah. And they synchronize with what we see here, obviously. I mean, I keep talking about the interview with Chris Smalls, and next week we're going to be talking with a couple of organizers, including a Teamsters organizer in Philadelphia. I think it's very, very important to take this opportunity to really think and really even just familiarize ourselves very specifically with the state of organized labor in this country and elsewhere. What is union density in this country? It's very small, obviously, and it's obviously much more represented in the public sector versus the private sector. We need to understand exactly where we are and exactly where there are opportunities with regards to labor mobilization, because ultimately there's no prospects for a left without mass organized labor. And I also do think because of the unique obscenity and pressure of this moment. And we're going to also talk more about those reopen protests in the post game and, the smart way of handling it, which disaggregates the AstroTurf element of people like the DeVos family and obviously the Nazi and neo-fascist elements, but also the reality that there's plenty of people that of course they feel a need to go back to work because there has been no proper bailout and protection for normal people. And this is the context we're in. If you don't speak directly to that politically and with an actual plan, then it will just get recycled into more basically death and waste.
Yeah. And, and we're very much exposed to not only to, these kind of crises be they through disease, but natural disasters have operated in the same way, especially in the United States, in how they're affecting different communities. And it's not an accident, basically, that it's like the poor and the working class communities that are bearing the brunt of this kind of global collapse that we're seeing both in the environment and in our global health. So, yeah, and, just speaking to the U.S., it's true that our density is low, and which means we're in a weak position. But it also means that we have a lot of potential to grow out, too. So we should think about it in that way as well, that we aren't as constrained when it comes to building out labor organizations as people in other countries are.
Right. And there is those opportunities.
Instead of having to fight only with a union bureaucracy like you have to in a lot of other countries.
Right. Right. And it's also a really, another really interesting question and thing to look at arising out of the 1990s with the complete where there was the rhetoric of international law, the rhetoric of international institutions, which really have very little power. I mean, obviously, there's countless examples of this, but, the Bush administration very consciously spitting in the face of the United Nations before the invasion of Iraq, as an example. And the fascinating and really disturbing thing is that in contrast to all these other kind of global efforts which fell short on the environment, on labor standards, and even on, to some extent, full funding for global health responses and pandemic preparedness and so on, the international trade architecture has actually been really vigorously enforced. And it has been an international mechanism that has really remapped the world and has had incredibly, huge consequences, like the factories in Juarez, which would not be there in the way they are without NAFTA, as an example. And so this is actually a really great example of how the sort of relationship between global trade and the institutions built up around that the corollaries you need with, as an example, global health infrastructure, have never been caught up, and they have not run in parallel. And so that's another thing, obviously, to bear in mind. And ultimately, again, I think we'll talk with Chuka Ejekman about this hopefully soon, but what is a grounded, real way of talking about how these labor movements can actually link up internationally? Does the International Labor Organization, which already exists, does that have mechanisms that can be reoccupied? How is communication infrastructure used? What does that actually look like concretely? It's really important, but it can't just be slotted as again, another sort of utopian project. It needs to be something that we actually really think about. And to the extent people like us have any role, attempt to facilitate if we can.
Yeah. And just recognizing too that I'm going to talk about this in the gem, but the opposing force has a very good consciousness of themselves. There's a reason, for example, that workers in the United States are so fragmented from their suppliers in Mexico, so that they can't build that kind of solidarity. And, so we have to do a lot of work on our end to actually be able to build that in the first place, while our opponents recognize that they need to keep people as far away from each other as possible, to be able to maintain their supremacy.
Right. Exactly. And that's actually another thing I'll tease in the post game is we have this great Alexander Coburn clip where he talks at the height of the Tea Party nonsense and the height of this sort of epic bullshit phase of Glenn Beck, but he already has a very strong critique of what should the left actually be doing with regards to that. And he has this great line about basically people becoming dupes and essentially becoming foot soldiers of HMOs through some kind of, through the kind of garbage that's peddled to them through the Glenn Becks of the world. And again, it's just the same dynamic. Condemnation is not going to get us anywhere. And at the very least, when you come with a compelling alternative, then you can disaggregate between, the people who are looking for something versus the people who are like, no, man, it's the Constitution, or whatever the fuck.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.